The Body in the Morning Room, a Miss Marple mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins when a body is discovered in the quiet morning room of an old country house. While everyone assumes it was an unfortunate accident, Miss Marple notices one small detail that changes everything. Before we uncover the truth behind The Body in the Morning Room, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales. The rain had been falling over St. Mary Mead since before breakfast. By 9:30, the village lanes were shining black beneath the bare branches, and every chimney seemed to be breathing smoke into the grey morning. Miss Marple sat beside her sitting-room window with her knitting untouched in her lap. She'd been watching a rook quarrel with a wet cat for nearly 10 minutes when the telephone rang. It was Inspector Harris. His voice sounded tired. "Miss Marple, I'm afraid I need you to come to Ashdown Hall." She lowered her knitting. "Has something happened?" "Yes, a rather unpleasant something." That was hardly the sort of sentence that made one hurry. Still, Miss Marple knew Inspector Harris well enough to understand that he wasn't a man who used unnecessary words. Ashdown Hall stood at the far end of the village, behind tall iron gates and a long gravel drive. Sir Edmund Vale had lived there for nearly 30 years. He was a wealthy widower, a collector of old books, and a man with a remarkable talent for making people uncomfortable at breakfast. His nephew, Richard, lived at the house. So did his niece, Clara, his private secretary, Lionel Brooks, and Mrs. Agnes Bell, the housekeeper. 4 people, Miss Marple thought, was quite enough for a respectable house. More than that, and someone usually started lying. Inspector Harris was waiting beneath the stone porch when Miss Marple arrived. His dark coat was wet at the shoulders, and his hat was pulled low over his forehead. "The body is in the morning room," he said. Miss Marple looked at him calmly. "Who found him?" "Mrs. Bell, at 8:15. "And the door?" "Unlocked." She paused for a moment. "That's interesting." Harris gave a weary sigh. "I knew you'd say that." "You mustn't blame me, Inspector. Doors are often very informative." The morning room was warm and comfortable, with green curtains, 2 leather chairs, a writing desk, and a large fireplace. Sir Edmund lay beside the desk. He'd been struck once on the back of the head. There was no weapon nearby. Miss Marple remained at the doorway for several seconds, saying nothing. She didn't look at the body first. She looked at the room. The position of the chairs, the curtains, the fireplace, the writing desk, the clock. Small things. People tended to ignore small things. Murderers depended upon it. A clock ticked softly above the fireplace. Tick, tick, tick. Beside Sir Edmund's chair stood a porcelain cup of tea. It was still warm. Inspector Harris opened his notebook. "Mrs. Bell says Sir Edmund came in here shortly after 7. She brought his tea at 7:15. She left at 7:20. Miss Marple looked at the cup. "And after that?" "According to everyone else, nobody entered the room." Miss Marple turned slowly towards him. "Nobody?" Harris hesitated. "That's what they say." She gave a faint smile. "People are remarkably fond of saying that." Richard Vale was waiting in the library. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, with tired eyes and an expensive suit that looked as though he'd slept in it. Before Inspector Harris could begin questioning him, Richard said, "I didn't kill my uncle." Harris looked at him. "That saves time." Richard didn't smile. He admitted he'd argued with Sir Edmund the previous evening about money. His uncle had threatened to change his will. Clara had also quarreled with him, though she refused to explain why. Mr. Brooks claimed he'd spent the entire morning upstairs in his office. Each person had a reason to dislike Sir Edmund. None seemed to have a reason strong enough to kill him. Miss Marple wasn't convinced. People didn't always kill for hatred. Sometimes they killed because they were afraid. Mrs. Bell was waiting in the servants' hall. She was a sturdy woman in her late 50s, with grey hair pulled neatly beneath a plain black dress. She'd worked for Sir Edmund for 22 years. He could be difficult, she said quietly, but nobody deserves to die like that. Miss Marple watched her carefully. You brought his tea? Yes. At 7:15? Yes. And you left at 7:20? Mrs. Bell nodded. I did. Miss Marple glanced towards the corridor. There was something about the woman's voice, not fear, not grief, something else, restraint, as though she were holding back a sentence. On the way back to the morning room, Miss Marple stopped. A thin brown mark ran along the edge of the carpet outside the door. It was almost invisible beneath the dim light. Harris noticed her looking at it. Mud, he said, probably from one of the servants. Miss Marple bent slightly, but didn't touch it. No. Harris raised an eyebrow. No. She straightened and looked towards the window at the end of the corridor. And there's something else. The mud is wet. It's been raining all morning. Exactly. Her voice became softer, which means whoever walked through it had been outside recently. But if they came in from the garden, why is there no mud on the inside edge of the window in the morning room? Harris stared at her. For once he had no immediate answer. Miss Marple returned to the room and examined the window. The latch was firmly closed. The curtains hung perfectly still. Beneath the window, the flower bed outside was dark with rain. There were no obvious footprints. Nothing. Yet the mud was there. Someone had walked through wet earth and brought part of it inside. Someone wanted the police to notice it. That was the important part. Miss Marple looked once more at the dead man's chair, then at the clock, then at the tea. Her expression changed almost imperceptibly. Inspector? Yes. What time did Sir Edmund usually take his tea? 7:15. And breakfast? 8. Miss Marple nodded. Then he was expecting to be alive for breakfast. Harris frowned. I'd say that's fairly obvious. Yes, she said, but the murderer didn't think it was. Before Harris could answer, a floorboard creaked somewhere upstairs. Both of them looked towards the ceiling. Another sound followed. A door closing. Slowly, carefully. Miss Marple picked up her handbag. Inspector, she said quietly, I think someone in this house has just realized that Sir Edmund's death isn't going to be as simple as they hoped. And upstairs, behind a locked bedroom door, someone was listening. Chapter 2. The Clock That Lied. By noon the rain had stopped, but Ashdown Hall remained gloomy and silent. Inspector Harris had questioned everyone twice, yet nothing had changed. Richard still admitted arguing with his uncle. Clara still refused to explain her quarrel with Sir Edmund. Mrs. Bell remained certain she'd left the morning room at 7:20. And Lionel Brooks continued to insist he'd been upstairs in his office all morning. Miss Marple found that last statement particularly interesting. People rarely remembered every minute of an ordinary morning, yet Brooks seemed determined to account for every one. Miss Marple returned to the morning room and stood before the mantel clock. Inspector, what time did Sir Edmund die? Harris checked his notebook. Between 7:20 and 7:40. She pointed towards the clock. And that stopped at 7:32. Yes. Miss Marple looked closely at the hands. Then someone wanted you to believe that. Harris stepped closer. The minute hand was slightly bent. There was also a tiny scratch around the winding key. The clock was moved, he said, or the hands were changed. Miss Marple nodded. Exactly. Someone wanted to create a false time of death. They found Lionel Brooks in the library. He was pale and nervous, his fingers constantly adjusting his spectacles. Harris questioned him about the missing money Sir Edmund had discovered. Brooks finally admitted he'd been stealing from his employer. He knew, said Brooks quietly. He was going to report me. Harris stared at him. And you still claim you never left your office? I didn't. Miss Marple watched him carefully.
You seem very certain." Brooks looked away. "Because it's true." Clara then told them she'd seen a man in a dark coat near the side gate at about 7:45. She hadn't seen his face, but she was certain he had come from the house. Harris immediately went outside. Beneath the morning-room window were several footprints in the wet flower bed. "There we are," he said. "Someone came through the garden." Miss Marple shook her head. "No, look at the prints." Harris crouched down again. The deeper part of each footprint showed the direction of movement. "They're coming towards the house," he said slowly. "Exactly," Miss Marple replied. "Someone walked into the garden and came back again. He wanted us to believe he'd escaped." They returned inside. Miss Marple examined the muddy mark on the corridor carpet. "The same shoes," she said. "Whoever made these footprints carried the mud inside deliberately." Harris looked troubled. "Then the murderer was already in the house." "Yes." Miss Marple glanced towards the library. "And someone in this house has an alibi that depends on the false time." Before Harris could answer, footsteps sounded in the corridor. Someone stopped outside the morning-room. There was silence. Then the footsteps moved away. Harris reached for the door. "Don't," Miss Marple said. He looked at her. "Why?" "Because whoever's out there wants to know how much we've discovered." Miss Marple turned back towards the clock. "And frightened people make mistakes, Inspector. Very serious mistakes."
Chapter 3. The Final Secret in the Morning Room. By 6 o'clock, the rain had returned to Ashdown Hall. It tapped against the windows and whispered through the bare trees outside. Inspector Harris had gathered everyone in the drawing-room. Richard stood beside the fireplace. Clara sat quietly on the sofa. Mrs. Bell remained near the door, her hands clasped tightly. Lionel Brooks sat apart from them all. He looked tired now, not frightened, defeated. Miss Marple stood beside the mantel and looked at each person in turn. "Sir Edmund was killed shortly after 7:20, she said, "not 7:32. The clock was altered to create a false time of death. The muddy footprints were arranged to make us believe someone had escaped through the garden, and Clara's sighting near the side gate was meant to support that story." Harris nodded slowly. "So the murderer was already inside the house?" "Yes," said Miss Marple. "And only one person needed that false story badly enough to create it." Her eyes settled on Lionel Brooks. Brooks went pale. "You killed Sir Edmund," Miss Marple said. "I didn't." "You did. Sir Edmund had discovered you'd been stealing from him. He intended to report you. You came to the morning-room after Mrs. Bell left. You argued, then you struck him." Brooks shook his head. "It was an accident. Perhaps the first blow was. Everything afterwards was not." The room fell silent. "You changed the clock," she continued. "You opened the window and walked through the flower bed. Then you returned through the front entrance, carrying mud onto the carpet. You wanted Inspector Harris to believe someone had come from outside and escaped into the garden." Harris stepped towards Brooks. "And the shoes?" Brooks said nothing. Miss Marple looked at Clara. "Under the back stairs." Clara nodded quietly. "I saw him hide them." Brooks closed his eyes. "I was frightened," she whispered. "He told him he'd ruined his life." Miss Marple's expression softened. "And you thought you were protecting him." Brooks suddenly looked at Miss Marple. "How did you know?" She smiled faintly. "The tea." He frowned. "Mrs. Bell left Sir Edmund at 7:20. His tea was still warm when he was found. The clock claimed something different. The room itself told us the truth."
Harris placed the handcuffs around Brooks's wrists. As he was led away, Brooks stopped at the doorway. "I never meant to kill him." Miss Marple looked at him sadly. "Most people who commit terrible acts say that, Mr. Brooks. They forget that the moment after a terrible mistake is often the moment when another choice must be made." The door closed behind him. For a few moments nobody moved. Then Mrs. Bell began clearing the tea things. Richard stood staring into the fire. Clara wiped her eyes and looked towards Miss Marple. "It's over," she said. Miss Marple picked up her knitting bag. "Yes," she replied, "for this house." Outside the rain had stopped. The clouds were breaking above the dark fields, and a pale moon appeared over the trees. Inspector Harris walked with Miss Marple to the front gate. "You've done it again," he said. Miss Marple smiled. "I only noticed what everyone else overlooked." Harris shook his head. "That's what you always say." "Because it's usually true." They both laughed softly. Then Miss Marple turned towards the village road. "Come along, Inspector. I've had enough murder for one day." Harris smiled. "Tea?" "Tea," she agreed. And so the mystery of the body in the morning room came to an end. Sir Edmund's murderer was caught. The false clock was exposed. The muddy footprints had told their little lie. And Ashdown Hall, for the first time in many hours, became quiet again. Yet Miss Marple knew something that Inspector Harris often forgot. In a village like St. Mary Mead, silence never lasted very long. There was always another secret behind another closed door, another whispered name, another innocent-looking cup of tea waiting beside an empty chair. And somewhere, someone was already preparing to tell the first lie of the next mystery. If you enjoyed this mystery, don't forget to subscribe to Haunting Vales for more Miss Marple stories, classic British village mysteries, and dark little secrets waiting to be uncovered. Until the next case, keep your eyes open, because sometimes the quietest room in the house is the one hiding the most dangerous secret.